Hi, welcome to our Math Dive in 5 for Kindergarten Geometric Reasoning, and today we're going to talk about two-dimensional figures. I'm Bailey Murphy, Math BRT. Before we dive into the benchmarks, let's take a minute and I want you to do this first task. So you're going to pause the video. You can complete the task on your own, or if you're watching this with a team or partner. While you're doing these tasks, we want you to be thinking about what student learning needs to look like for students to be successful with each task. We also want you to consider what are some misconceptions that your students might have and how can we address those. So here are your first tasks. Go ahead and pause the video and we'll see you back in just a minute. If we think about the progression with BEST, we know that kindergarten is the starting foundation. So there's a lot of different learning targets in here, and students are going to have to identify, compare, and sort 2D figures based on similarities, differences, position, and regardless of their size or their orientation. Kindergarten students are going to be focusing on circles, triangles, rectangles, and squares. They're also going to have to compose a 2D composite figure using triangles, rectangles, and squares. And then students will have to find real-world objects that can be modeled with 2D figures. This learning is built on in first grade, where students are going to continue to identify, compare, and sort 2D figures, and they're going to have all the figures that they had in kindergarten, plus semicircles, trapezoids, and hexagons. In first grade, students will be expected to sketch a 2D figure with specific attributes. They'll compose and decompose 2D figures, and they'll continue to identify 2D figures that are modeled in the real-world objects. This video is going to focus heavily on the kindergarten benchmarks, and we're going to focus a lot on the identifying by different attributes and composing composite figures with 2D figures. Throughout this unit, students should have concrete models, and they should have a variety of types. If you look on the screen, you can see we have some attribute blocks, we have geoboards, we have popsicle sticks, and even egg legs. Whatever the concrete model is, students should have them so they can begin to understand the defining attributes and use those attributes to start identifying different shapes. As students begin to understand 2D figures, we should give them lots of opportunities to explore these 2D figures and sort them in a variety of ways. So take a minute and look at the shapes on your screen and think about how you or a student might sort these shapes. You could sort by the number of sides, maybe the number of corners or vertices. Does it have points or no points? Does it have straight or curved lines? Or even, is it just the same shape? There is no single right answer when students are sorting, as long as they can explain why they sorted it a certain way and how their shapes fit into each of those categories. This will help develop the foundation for how students can use defining attributes to identify their 2D figures. Once students start to sort and explore those 2D figures, we can start to use defining attributes to identify them. In this point, we want students to be exposed to 2D figures that are different sizes, colors, orientation, and relative position. So take a minute and look at the rectangles and triangles on your screen. Notice that they're all different shapes, different sizes, different colors, and we know that kindergarten students may really struggle to understand that group of rectangles, they're all rectangles because they have 4 sides, 4 corners. And same thing with the triangles. Those are all triangles, even though they kind of look a little different. They still have the same defining attributes of 3 sides and 3 vertices or 3 corners. Students will struggle with this orientation, so that's why we want to have those concrete models in front of them so that they can physically turn and see that the shape does not change. It just changes where it is and how it's facing. In kindergarten, students are limited to having to identify circles, triangles, rectangles, and squares. That doesn't mean we can't use other figures in our instruction, but when we're thinking about what students have to do to be successful at this benchmark, they have to identify circles, triangles, rectangles, and squares. We can also use examples and non-examples to help students really understand those defining attributes. If you take a look at this group of shapes, it's supposed to be looking for triangles. There's only 2 triangles in there that have the defining attributes. The other 3 shapes do not have the 3 sides or the 3 corners, and we want students to be able to understand that. So let's take a look back at that first task we had, where you had to circle all the figures that had 4 sides. This would be an example of a task that students could do to show their understanding of identifying using specific attributes. Take note that some of the shapes are filled in and some of them are outlined. This is totally okay, and we need students to be exposed to many different types so that they understand it doesn't matter what's filled in, those defining attributes are what we're looking for. As students begin to understand defining attributes, they can identify, compare, and sort these 2D figures. They should be able to determine the number of vertices or corners, the number of sides, and does the shape have curved or straight lines. Students will then use this understanding to identify 2D figures in real-world objects. So if you look at the screen, there's a chessboard. Students should be able to say that I could model that using a square. As students begin to develop an understanding of defining attributes and how these attributes can be used to identify 2D figures, they can then start to compose composite figures. Students should be given a variety of triangles, rectangles, and squares to compose new composite figures, and we want students to have the concrete model that they can manipulate in front of them. Once students make a composite figure, they're not expected to formally name the figure, especially if it's not one that's in their benchmark. So for example, if they put the square and the triangle together to make a house, that's okay. But if students are putting together two triangles and they make a square or a rectangle, we would expect them to be able to formally identify their new composite figure. Going back to the task that you were asked to complete at the beginning of the video, this is where students are going to need to understand how they can manipulate those shapes to make a new composite figure, and also understand that their new composite figure can be identified or cannot be identified as a rectangle. As we think about the CRA thinking throughout this unit, we know that our kindergarten students need to spend a lot of time in that concrete stage so they can develop that foundation understanding of defining attributes and identifying 2D figures. As they begin to manipulate those concrete and really begin to understand what's going on with those shapes and what the defining attributes are, they can then look at shapes on a paper and be able to identify using their defining attributes. As students move into that abstract thinking, this would be where I can identify a triangle because I know it has 3 sides and 3 vertices, and I may not need to draw a picture or even use a model to see what it is. This is not a linear progression, and students will need to go back and forth all the time throughout this unit to really solidify their understanding of defining attributes and composing 2D figures. Thanks so much for watching this Math Dive in 5 for kindergarten and 2-dimensional figures. We'll see you next time.